Hi there. Welcome to Dreamy Histories channel. Tonight, we're standing in a misty dawn somewhere along the English coast, circa 865 AD, and you can smell the salt spray mixing with something else. Something metallic and wrong. That's blood. Fresh blood. And it's everywhere because the great heathen army just finished introducing the locals to their favorite party trick, the blood eagle. You're about to discover that Vikings weren't just raiders with horned helmets. Spoiler, they didn't wear those. They were psychological warfare specialists who understood that true power came from making your enemies too terrified to fight back. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Drop a comment with where you're watching from and what time it is. I love seeing our global community of night owls and history lovers. Now, close your eyes and listen. You're kneeling in wet grass, watching as Viking warriors drag a captured noble toward a wooden frame. The man's screams have already gone hoarse, but the real horror hasn't started yet. The blood eagle, Etastarpi in Old Norse, isn't just an execution method. It's performance art designed to send a message that echoes through generations. Picture this. They lay the victim face down, slice open the back along the spine, then carefully break the ribs away from the backbone, pulling them outward like wings. Still conscious, historians debate whether anyone could actually survive this long. The victim's lungs are pulled out through the gaps, creating the eagle's wings that give this nightmare its name. Salt is rubbed into the wounds because apparently Vikings believed in seasoning everything. The psychological genius here makes modern horror movies look like bedtime stories. You see, Vikings understood that fear spreads faster than any army. Kill one man brutally enough, and you won't have to fight his 10 brothers. They'll be too busy having nightmares. King Ella of Northumbria learned this the hard way when Ivar the Boneless allegedly gave him the full eagle treatment in 867 AD. Whether it actually happened or was just Viking PR, historians still argue whether the blood eagle was real or exaggerated propaganda. The mere rumor of it made entire villages abandon their homes at the first sight of longships. What's truly disturbing is how ritualistic they made it. This wasn't rage-fueled violence. It was calculated, almost religious. Some sagas describe it as an offering to Odin, complete with specific prayers and ceremonial procedures. Imagine being so committed to psychological warfare that you develop a torture method with its own user manual. The Vikings who performed these acts weren't mindless barbarians. They were educated in anatomy, patient enough for precision work, and cold enough to treat human suffering as a tool. One account describes how they'd sometimes keep physicians nearby, not to help the victim, but to ensure they stayed conscious longer. The blood eagle served multiple purposes beyond simple execution. It demonstrated medical knowledge. You try extracting lungs without killing someone immediately. Artistic vision. The wings were apparently arranged symmetrically, an absolute dominance over the enemy's body and soul. Vikings believed dying well mattered. Warriors who died bravely went to Valhalla. But blood eagle victims, they died helpless, on their stomachs, unable to face their killers or grip weapons. In Viking culture, this was worse than death. It was spiritual annihilation. Modern historians debate everything about the blood eagle. Some argue it's physically impossible. The victim would die from shock long before the wings could be spread. Others point to similar practices in other cultures as evidence it could work. There's even disagreement about translation. Some scholars think blood eagle might refer to battlefield carrion birds rather than human torture. But here's what matters: whether real or legend, the blood eagle worked exactly as intended. Medieval chroniclers wrote about it with barely concealed terror. Entire military strategies changed because commanders factored in what might happen if they were captured. The Vikings had weaponized fear itself, and the blood eagle was their nuclear option, a doomsday device made of bone and blood that ensured enemies would think twice, thrice, and then probably just pay the Danegeld instead. You're standing in a Norwegian meadow, watching a group of warriors prepare for battle, but something's wrong with this picture. They're stripping naked in freezing weather, gnawing on their wooden shields like rabid dogs. And their eyes, God, their eyes are rolling back, showing only whites. These are berserkers, and in about 30 seconds, they're going to become the most terrifying force on any medieval battlefield. The word berserk literally means bare shirt, though these particular gentlemen seem to have misplaced theirs along with their sanity and basic human decency. The transformation begins with what you might recognize as pharmaceutical assistance. They're chewing something, possibly fly agaric mushrooms, though historians still argue whether it was drugs, mental illness, or self-induced hysteria. Whatever the recipe, it's working. Their bodies start shaking violently, foam gathering at their mouths like rabid animals. One warrior bites down so hard on his shield that splinters embed in his gums, blood mixing with saliva as he grins. Another is making sounds that aren't quite human, somewhere between a bear's roar and a death rattle. The temperature's below freezing, but sweat pours off their naked bodies as their internal furnaces go nuclear. Then the switch flips, and you understand why armies would literally run away rather than face these monsters. A berserker in full fury doesn't feel pain. You could stab him, and he'd use your sword as a handle to pull himself closer. Historical accounts describe berserkers taking multiple fatal wounds and continuing to fight, sometimes for minutes after they should have been corpses. One saga tells of a berserker who got a spear through his chest, pulled it out, and used it to kill 3 enemies before finally noticing he was dead. They attack everything: enemies, allies, trees, rocks, because in their state, the whole world becomes a threat that needs destroying. The mainstream historical fact: King Harold Fairhair employed berserkers as royal bodyguards in the 9th century, giving them special legal status. The quirky tidbit? These same elite warriors were banned from many Viking settlements during peacetime because they had an unfortunate habit of going berserk at wedding feasts and murdering guests over imagined slights. Imagine being such a liability that even Vikings think you need a timeout. You watch as the berserker unit charges into battle, and it's less military maneuver and more natural disaster with legs. They don't use tactics or formations, just pure, distilled violence delivered at sprint speed. One berserker catches an arrow in his shoulder and doesn't even slow down. Another takes a sword strike across his ribs that opens him up like an anatomy lesson, but he's too busy beating someone to death with their own helmet to notice. The enemy line wavers, then breaks. Nobody wants to fight an opponent who treats dismemberment as a minor inconvenience. What made berserkers truly terrifying wasn't just their fury, it was the aftermath. When the rage finally faded, usually after everyone else was dead, they'd collapse into a weakness called berserkergang. For days afterward, they'd be as helpless as newborns, barely able to lift their heads. This vulnerability should have made them easy targets, but Vikings understood psychology. They made sure everyone knew that killing a helpless berserker meant his brothers would visit your village, and suddenly you'd have 12 more of these nightmares to deal with. The math was simple. Leave the exhausted monster alone, or multiply your problems exponentially. The Berserker phenomenon reveals something deeply disturbing about Viking warfare philosophy. They didn't just accept that some warriors would lose their minds in battle. They cultivated it, refined it, turned madness into a military specialty. Berserker training involved deliberate psychological conditioning, possibly including isolation, fasting, and ritual practices designed to break down normal behavioral inhibitions. They created human weapons who could switch off their humanity like flipping a light switch. And even worse, they could switch it back on afterward and go home to their families. Modern scholars debate whether berserkers represent an early form of combat-induced dissociative disorder, deliberate drug use, or genetic predisposition to certain mental states. Some suggest the bear warrior concept connected to shape-shifting beliefs, that berserkers literally thought they became animals during their fury. Whatever the truth, these warriors left such a traumatic impression on European consciousness that 1,000 years later, we still use their name to describe uncontrollable rage. That's effective branding through terror. Viking style. You're crouched behind a fallen log in a Germanic forest, trying to control your breathing, but it's no use. They already know you're here. The Ulfhedna have been tracking you for 3 days, and now you can hear them howling in the distance, except the howls are getting closer, and they're coming from different directions. These aren't the naked madmen from earlier. These are Viking special forces who've taken wolf warfare to an art form, and you're about to become their latest masterpiece of psychological destruction. The first one appears like smoke between the trees, wearing a wolf pelt that makes his silhouette inhuman in the twilight. Unlike berserkers who stripped naked, Ulfhedna dressed for intimidation, wolf heads worn as hoods, pelts draped over shoulders, some even wearing wolf jawbones as macabre necklaces. But it's the way they move that makes your skin crawl. They've studied actual wolf packs, adopting their hunting patterns, their patience, their ability to appear from nowhere. You hear a twig snap behind you, classic misdirection, and when you turn back, 3 more have materialized in front of you, heads tilted at that unsettling angle that's neither fully human nor fully animal. They don't attack immediately. That's not the wolf way. Instead, they circle, maintaining perfect spacing, occasionally letting out these throat sounds that might be communication, or might just be designed to make you soil yourself. One drops to all fours, moving with disturbing fluidity, and you realize he's been practicing that motion until it became natural. Another starts this low, rumbling growl that you feel in your chest cavity. The psychological pressure builds until you almost wish they'd just attack and get it over with, which is exactly what they want. Prey that breaks mentally fights poorly. Here's your mainstream history lesson. Ulfhedna appear in multiple sagas as elite warriors associated with Odin, who was himself often accompanied by wolves. The quirky detail. Archaeological evidence suggests some Ulfhednar filed their teeth to points, because apparently wearing wolf pelts wasn't quite committed enough to the aesthetic. Historians still argue whether Ulfhednar and berserkers were distinct warrior classes or regional variations of the same terrifying concept. Imagine academic conferences debating the proper taxonomy of nightmares. The pack hunting tactics were revolutionary for medieval warfare. While most warriors focused on individual combat glory, Ulfhednar operated in coordinated units of 6 to 12 fighters who trained together until they could predict each other's movements without words. They designate an alpha who directed the pack through subtle gestures, surround isolated targets, and use relay attacks where fresh wolves would replace tired ones seamlessly. You're experiencing this now, as they take turns feinting at you, each fake charge forcing you to react, wearing down your nerves and reflexes without ever fully committing to an attack. What truly separated Ulfhedna from berserkers was control. These weren't rage monsters. They were calculating predators who used their wolf personas as psychological weapons. They'd spend weeks before battles leaving wolf tracks around enemy camps, howling at night to deprive opponents of sleep, even dragging wolf-killed deer carcasses where patrols would find them. By the time the actual battle came, half their enemies were already beaten, jumping at shadows and too exhausted to fight effectively. One account describes Ulfhedna placing wolf puppies in the tents of sleeping enemies. Imagine waking up to that and trying to fight the next day. The initiation rituals for becoming Ulfhedna make modern special forces training look like summer camp. Candidates would supposedly spend winters alone in the wilderness, required to survive entirely by hunting like wolves. They'd practice moving silently through forests while wearing pelts and equipment, learning to navigate by scent and sound. Some sagas mention a final test where initiates had to track and kill an actual wolf using only primitive weapons, then wear its skin as their warrior identity, whether true or mythology. The stories created an aura of supernatural ability around these warriors. You feel the attack coming before it happens, a shift in their breathing pattern, a subtle tensing of muscles. When they strike, it's from every direction at once, and you understand why even other Vikings spoke of Ulfhedna with nervous respect. They fight like wolves. One goes for your weapon arm while another targets your legs. A third circles behind for your exposed back, or they rotate attacks, never letting you focus on one threat. And those filed teeth aren't just for show, as you discover when one gets close enough to demonstrate. The last thing you register before darkness takes you is that they're not even breathing hard. For them, this was just practice, and tomorrow they'll find new prey to stalk through these endless forests. You're being dragged into a great hall by iron-hard hands, thrown onto rush-covered floors that smell of old mead and fresh fear. And when you look up, you see him. Ivar the Boneless sits on a carved throne, and your first thought is that the sagas lied. He's not crippled at all. Then he gestures for you to be brought closer, and you realize the truth is worse. His legs don't work, haven't since birth, but his mind is a weapon that's conquered kingdoms. Those pale eyes are dissecting you like you're a puzzle he's already solved. And his smile says he's about to demonstrate exactly why physical strength means nothing when you can make armies dance to your whims. The nickname Boneless has spawned 1,000 historian debates. Some claim it meant he was flexible like a contortionist, others that he had brittle bone disease, and a few suggest it was a mistranslation meaning hated rather than boneless. But you're looking at those withered legs, the way his warriors carry him on a shield when he needs to move, and you know the mainstream history is right. This is a man who couldn't walk yet commanded the great heathen army that brought England to its knees. The quirky detail. Sagas describe him being carried into battle on a shield held by 4 warriors, shooting arrows with impossible accuracy while being jostled around like the world's deadliest carnival game. Ivar leans forward, speaking in that soft voice that somehow carries to every corner of the hall, and explains why you're still alive. He doesn't need another warrior. He has thousands. What he needs is information, and he's going to get it through methods that make the blood eagle look merciful. See, Ivar understood that physical torture has limits. Bodies break. People pass out. Death provides escape, but psychological torture, that can last forever. He tells you about the last spy who wouldn't talk, how Ivar had the man's family brought in, not to hurt them, just to have dinner together every night while the spy watched from a cage, unable to speak to them, until madness took him and he begged to confess everything. The strategic genius becomes apparent as Ivar unfolds a map of England, moving pieces with those long, clever fingers. While his brothers charged into battle seeking glory, Ivar played long games. He'd identified every weakness in Anglo-Saxon politics, which lords hated each other, who could be bribed, where the church's gold was hidden. He tells you about taking York, how he spread rumours of his army's movements in 3 different directions, then attacked from the 4th, while the defenders were scattered and confused. Physical strength would have taken the walls eventually. Ivar took them without losing a man because the gates were opened from inside by guards he'd spent months converting. You watch him orchestrate terror like a conductor with an orchestra. A messenger arrives reporting resistance in a captured village. Ivar doesn't order executions. Too simple. Too forgettable. Instead, he has one person from each family taken as hostage, treated well, given good food and warm clothes. Then he sends the families letters from their loved ones describing this kind treatment, along with a simple message. Rebellion means the kindness stops. The psychological weight of being responsible for turning comfort into torture breaks resistance faster than any amount of violence. He's weaponized hope itself. The most unsettling part is his complete lack of ego about his condition. Other leaders might overcompensate, might rage against their limitations. Ivar turned his disability into an advantage. He couldn't lead charges, so he perfected battlefield command from elevated positions. He couldn't duel, so he became untouchable through politics and fear. He even used his condition strategically. Enemies would underestimate the cripple, agree to meetings thinking him harmless, only to discover that a mind that sharp doesn't need functioning legs to destroy you. One saga describes him pretending to have a seizure during negotiations, causing opponents to lower their guard, then recovering to dictate terms while they were still off balance. Historians still argue whether Ivar's condition made him crueler, or if he would have been a monster regardless. But watching him work, you understand it doesn't matter. He's proof that Vikings valued intelligence as much as strength, that their culture could produce strategic geniuses alongside berserkers. He commands through pure force of personality and the knowledge that crossing him means facing something worse than death, irrelevance. He doesn't need to personally wield a sword when he can wield entire armies like extensions of his will. As his guards drag you away to whatever sophisticated nightmare he's planned, you realize the most terrifying Viking warrior you've met is the one who can't even stand. You're standing in the marble halls of Constantinople's imperial palace, sweating through your Byzantine court robes, trying not to stare at the giants flanking Emperor Basil II's throne. These are the Varangians, and everything about them screams wrong. Norse warriors in Byzantine purple, battle axes in a palace of political knives, pagans guarding a Christian emperor. The cognitive dissonance would be funny if these weren't the most professionally lethal humans you've ever encountered. That blonde one who just shifted his grip on his axe. He's calculating exactly how many steps it would take to split your skull. Not because you're a threat, but because that's what he does with everyone, automatically, like breathing. The Varangian Guard represents Viking evolution, from raiders to the ancient world's most elite military unit. These aren't desperate warriors seeking plunder. They're professionals who've turned loyalty into a science. The recruitment process alone would break most men. First, you need to be Scandinavian, or from Viking-settled lands. They made exceptions for Anglo-Saxons after 1066, because nothing says career change like losing your entire country to Normans. Then, you pay your own way to Constantinople, a journey that kills half who attempt it. If you survive, you present yourself with your own weapons and armor, because Varangians don't do standard issue. Then comes the loyalty oath, sworn on both Christian relics and Norse gods, because the Byzantines understood that covering all theological bases prevented loopholes. The emperor walks past, and you watch every Varangian's eyes track him with the intensity of hunting wolves. Here's your mainstream history. Varangians were so fanatically loyal that they'd commit suicide rather than survive their emperor's death. The quirky detail: they had the legal right to raid the imperial treasury when an emperor died. It was called palace plundering, and it was basically a loyalty bonus paid in whatever you could carry. Historians still argue whether this was brilliant psychology, letting them profit from the emperor's death only after protecting him to the end, or just Byzantine bureaucracy accepting that you can't stop Vikings from looting something. What made Varangians terrifying wasn't their size or their axes. It was their absolute incorruptibility in a city built on corruption. Byzantine politics operated on assassination, bribery, and betrayal. Everyone had a price except these northern madmen who'd kill their own brothers if ordered. One recorded incident tells of a Varangian who discovered his own son plotting against the emperor. The guard dragged his boy before the throne, announced the treason, then executed him personally before returning to his post like nothing happened. Even hardened Byzantine courtiers found that disturbing, which takes some doing. You're witnessing their combat doctrine during a demonstration. It's Viking brutality refined by Byzantine tactics. They fight in a modified shield wall that incorporates Greek fire throwers. Because why choose between burning enemies and chopping them when you can do both? Those famous Danish axes have been modified for palace work. Slightly shorter handles for corridor fighting. Hooks added for pulling down mounted opponents or unfortunate conspirators trying to flee. They train in the palace's underground chambers, and servants whisper about the sounds that echo up, metal on stone, metal on metal, and occasionally metal on meat when they practice on condemned prisoners. The psychological impact of Varangians extended beyond their martial prowess. Imagine being a Byzantine noble, raised in luxury and intrigue, suddenly confronted by men who've made honesty a weapon. They can't be bribed, can't be blackmailed, barely speak your language, and consider your sophisticated political machinations roughly as honorable as sheep theft. Worse, they're not stupid. Many learned Greek, studied Byzantine law, and used their untouchable status to gather intelligence. They're the emperor's eyes and ears and axes, and everyone knows it. Court meetings involve dozens of brilliant minds trying to plot around the reality that 6 feet of homicidal Nordic loyalty stands between them and any meaningful conspiracy. The unit's most famous member, Harold Hardrada, remember that wolf pelt enthusiast from earlier? He's back, and now he's got Byzantine training. Served for a decade before leaving with enough gold to claim Norway's throne. He brought back more than wealth. He brought Byzantine military innovations, siege techniques, and the peculiar Varangian blend of Eastern tactics and Northern brutality. The Guard continued for centuries, outlasting the Vikings themselves, because once you create the perfect warrior unit, why mess with success? Even when the last Scandinavians aged out, the tradition continued with other foreigners, though none quite captured that original Viking magic of turning professional loyalty into a form of religious devotion. with really good retirement benefits. You're standing on a Baltic island fortress, watching 300 men train in perfect synchronization, and slowly realizing these aren't just raiders, they're a corporation. The Jomsvikings have turned warfare into a business model that would make modern military contractors weep with envy. Their fortress of Jomsborg rises from the mist like something from a fever dream, its walls carved with strict rules that make monastic vows look permissive. No women allowed inside, no man over 50 or under 18. No feuds between members, disputes settled by combat. Loser's property goes to the winner. Everyone moves on. They've created a warrior monastery where the only religion is professional violence. The initiation ritual is happening today, and you're grateful you're just observing. The candidate, a scarred veteran who's already famous for raids in Ireland, must defeat a current member in single combat, not to the death, because that's wasteful, but until one yields. Then comes the interesting part. He must let another member strike him with a sword, taking the blow without flinching or defending himself. It's not about pain tolerance, it's about trust. If you're going to stand in a shield wall with these men, they need to know you'll hold position even when death is guaranteed. The candidate takes a strike across his ribs that opens him to the bone, doesn't even blink, and the Jomsvikings cheer their newest brother. The mainstream historical fact is that the Jomsvikings were possibly founded by Harold Bluetooth. Yes, the technology is named after him. As a semi-independent military force. The quirky tidbit: they apparently had a marketing department. Jomsvikings would send poets to foreign courts to spread tales of their victories, creating a reputation that let them charge premium rates. Historians still argue whether Jomsborg was a real place or a composite legend of various Viking mercenary bands, though the consistency of accounts suggests something very real and very organized operated from that Baltic fortress. You observe their training regime, and it's clear why kings paid fortune for their services. Every Jomsviking can fight with any weapon, swim in full armor, navigate by stars, and perform basic field surgery. They drill formations until muscle memory overrides thought, shield walls that move like single organisms, feigned retreats executed with theatrical precision, cavalry charges that hit exactly where planned. But the real innovation is their complete disconnection from tribal loyalty. Other Vikings fight for clan, glory, or gods. Jomsvikings fight for contract fulfillment and professional reputation. They've turned warfare from passion to profession. The psychological edge comes from their reliability. When you hire most Viking bands, you're gambling. Will they stay bought? Will they get drunk and switch sides? Will they abandon the field if the battle goes badly? Jomsvikings have a completion rate that borders on supernatural. One saga tells of a Jomsviking unit that held a bridge for 3 days as agreed, even after their employer was killed and no one remained to pay them. They held it because the contract specified 3 days, and their reputation was worth more than their lives. That kind of insane professional ethics terrifies opponents who expect mercenaries to be motivated by survival. Living conditions in Jomsborg reveal how they maintain such discipline. Communal meals where seating was determined by proven valor, kill more enemies, sit closer to the chieftain, shared wealth distribution based on participation and performance, no idle rich, no poor heroes, mandatory training schedules that would exhaust Olympic athletes. Even entertainment was regimented, storytelling nights where warriors recited sagas of past victories, reinforcing corporate culture through oral tradition. They created a self-sustaining warrior ecosystem where the only way up was through excellence and the only way out was death or old age. The fortress design itself was psychological warfare. Approaching armies would see walls decorated with the shields of defeated enemies, arranged in patterns that told stories of Viking victories. The main gate was supposedly built from ship prows taken from naval battles. Inside, everything was designed for efficiency. Armories organized like modern supply chains, training grounds that could simulate any terrain, even a hospital staffed by warriors who'd learned healing arts during the mandatory wounded but not dead phase of their careers. They professionalized every aspect of warfare, including recovery. Watching them prepare for their next contract, a 3-month engagement supporting the King of Denmark, you see medieval warfare's future. They're checking equipment with standardized lists, running communication drills, even conducting what looks suspiciously like a risk assessment briefing. These aren't barbarians. They're a military corporation 5 centuries before anyone coined the term. As they march out in perfect formation, singing work songs that sound more like cadence calls than Viking chants, you understand why even other Vikings spoke of them with awed respect. They took the chaos of warfare and made it orderly, profitable, and somehow even more terrifying. You're crouched in a Norwegian longhouse, trying to become invisible as she enters. Freydis Eriksdotter, and the blood on her sword isn't from cooking accidents. The men around you, hardened Vikings who've raided from Iceland to Ireland, are doing that thing where they're trying to look casual while desperately avoiding eye contact. She's 8 months pregnant, which apparently just makes her angrier, and she's just finished single-handedly routing a Native American war party in Vinland by pulling out one breast and slapping it with a sword while screaming. The warriors explain this to you in whispers, like they're still processing it themselves. Even berserkers think she's a bit much. The shield maiden concept has been debated, dismissed, and rediscovered so many times that archaeologists probably get whiplash. For decades, scholars insisted Viking women stayed home, tended hearths, and definitely didn't decapitate enemies. Then DNA testing happened. That famous Burka warrior grave with the full weapon set, 2 horses, and tactical board game, the one everyone assumed belonged to a male chieftain. Surprise, the pelvis was female. Suddenly, all those saga references to women warriors stopped looking like poetic license and started looking like job descriptions. Freydis settles into recounting her Vinland adventure, and you realize she's not an anomaly. She's an extreme example of something larger, Viking society, for all its masculine chest-thumping, operated on pragmatism. When men went raiding for years, someone had to defend the homestead. When colonies needed every fighter, nobody checked under chainmail for appropriate equipment. The mainstream fact is that Viking women had more legal rights than most European women until the 20th century. They could own land, request divorces, run businesses. The quirky detail? Some runestones mention women who commissioned their own Viking raids, essentially prehistoric venture capitalists funding violence for profit. You watch other women in the hall, noting how many carry knives with the comfort of long practice. One has scarring consistent with shield-edge strikes. Another absent-mindedly sharpens a hand axe while nursing an infant. Multitasking that would terrify modern parenting groups. The woman serving mead has forearms like a blacksmith's, and when some drunk warrior grabs her inappropriately, she breaks his nose with casual efficiency before continuing her rounds. Nobody even comments. This is normal here, where the line between warrior and woman blurs based on necessity rather than ideology. Historians still argue whether shield maidens were common or exceptional, but the evidence keeps mounting. Weapon graves with female remains appear across Scandinavia. Battlefield trauma on female skeletons matches warrior patterns. Byzantine historians mention women among Viking forces with confused horror. Irish annals describe red women among raiders, which could mean hair colour or blood coverage, possibly both. The sagas name dozens of women warriors, from Hervor, who demanded her father's cursed sword from his ghost, to Thornbjorg, who led her own ship on raids. Either Vikings had incredibly consistent fiction writers, or women warriors were common enough to be unremarkable. The psychological impact of facing shield maidens went beyond simple surprise. Viking gender roles were fluid enough that enemies couldn't assume anything based on appearance. That figure in chainmail might be someone's teenage daughter who's been training with weapons since she could walk. The person holding the shield wall might be defending children literally hidden behind her. It added another layer of uncertainty to Viking warfare. Not only were you fighting bears and wolves in human form, but that human form might belong to someone who learned blade work between pregnancy and weaving lessons. Freydis finishes her story by explaining how she handled the men who wanted to abandon the Vinland colony. She agreed they could leave, then murdered them in their sleep because cowardice offended her more than disloyalty. Even the other women in the hall look uncomfortable at this part. There's pragmatic violence, and then there's Freydis, who operates on a level that makes regular shield maidens seem reasonable. As she heads to bed, still wearing her blood-stained clothes because why waste washing water, one of the men mutters that she's carrying her third child and gods help anyone who threatens it. Another adds that her brothers refuse to raid with her anymore, not from shame, but from self-preservation. The evening continues with women and men mingling as equals in warfare discussions. And you understand this isn't feminist revisionism, it's Viking practicality. When your society values martial skill above everything, refusing capable fighters based on anatomy is wasteful. Shield maidens weren't breaking gender barriers. Those barriers never existed here in the same way. They were just Vikings who happened to give birth between raids. And honestly, facing someone who considers childbirth a minor inconvenience between battles might be the most terrifying thing yet. You're sitting in an Icelandic hall, trying to eat your meal while Egil Skallagrimsson composes poetry about the man he murdered this morning. He's drunk, but then he's always drunk, and his massive frame makes the bench creak as he sways, reciting verses that somehow rhyme blood eagle with breakfast table. This is Iceland's most famous warrior poet, a man who's been killing people and writing about it for 60 years. And what's truly disturbing is that his poetry is actually good. He catches you staring and grins, showing gaps where teeth should be, and offers to compose a verse about you. Several people immediately excuse themselves from the hall. You understand, Egil's poems about people tend to become their obituaries. The saga of Egil begins with genetics that read like a monster origin story. His grandfather was Kveldulf, Evening Wolf, who supposedly transformed into something inhuman after dark. His father, Skallagrim, went into berserker rages so severe that neighbors built a separate island forge for him to destroy when the mood struck. By the time Egil was born, the family had concentrated 3 generations of barely controlled violence into one massive, ugly baby who came out of the womb looking for a fight. At 3 years old, he was already terrifyingly strong. At 7, he killed his first victim, another child who cheated him in a ball game. His mother's response: pride that he'd shown such classic Viking spirit. Here's your mainstream history. Egil lived from roughly 904 to 995 AD, making him one of the longest-lived Vikings in an era where dying of old age usually meant surviving to 40. The quirky detail: he suffered from Paget's disease, which caused his skull to grow continuously throughout his life. By his 80s, his head was so enlarged and thick that when Christians dug up his bones centuries later, they tested the skull's strength by hitting it with an axe. It bounced off, even dead. Egil was hard to kill. You watch him drain another horn of mead, and someone whispers the count. That's his 14th tonight. Enough to kill a normal man. But Egil's liver apparently signed a different contract. His tolerance for alcohol parallels his tolerance for violence, essentially unlimited. The combination made him uniquely dangerous. Other berserkers had to work themselves into rage. Egil maintained a constant simmer of alcohol-fueled aggression that could boil over at any moment. He once attended a feast where the host tried to poison him. Egil noticed, killed the host, composed an insulting poem about his hospitality, then finished the feast because waste not, want not. The poetry complicates everything. This man who's killed more people than most plagues writes verses of genuine beauty and complex wordplay. He pioneers new forms of skaldic poetry while pioneering new ways to separate heads from bodies. After his favorite son drowns, Egil locks himself away and composes Sonatorek, the loss of sons. A poem so heartbreaking that it's still studied in universities. Then he emerges from mourning and immediately kills 3 men in a property dispute. The cognitive dissonance of a sensitive artist who expresses feelings through homicide breaks modern categories. His feuds were legendary in their pettiness and persistence. King Eric Bloodaxe, yes, that Eric from later, and Egil hated each other with the passion of 1,000 suns. When Eric became king of Norway, he outlawed Egil. Egil responded by killing Eric's son and supporters, then erected a scorn pole, a horse head on a stick with runes cursing the king, before fleeing to Iceland. Years later, shipwrecked in Eric's territory and facing execution, Egil saved himself by composing a praise poem so magnificent that even Eric couldn't kill him afterward. He weaponized poetry like others weaponize swords. The longevity adds another terrifying dimension. Most violent Vikings died young in glorious battle. Egil survived everything: battles, feuds, berserker rages, enough alcohol to pickle a whale, and his own terrible personality. By his 70s, he was blind, crippled, and still trying to start fights at the Althing, Iceland's parliament. He planned to throw his life's accumulated silver into the crowd to cause a riot, but his family stopped him. Even approaching 90, bedridden and dying, he murdered a servant who annoyed him. His last recorded words were complaints that he couldn't make it to the main hall to die properly in front of everyone. Egil finally finishes his poem. It's about you, comparing your face to a badly butchered seal and suggesting innovative uses for your intestines. The hall erupts in laughter and applause because it's genuinely clever wordplay, even if it's also a death threat in iambic pentameter. This is Viking warrior culture at its most refined and most savage. A man who'll split your skull with an axe, then compose a grammatically perfect verse about the sound it made. As he stumbles off to find more mead or more victims, you understand why Egil's saga remains the most popular. He's the Viking warrior archetype taken to its logical, terrifying, weirdly artistic conclusion. You're standing in a Byzantine court, watching Harold Hardrada negotiate with Emperor Constantine IX, and the tension is thick enough to choke on. This is the same Harold who served as a Varangian, But now he's returned as something far more dangerous. A Viking who's learned every civilized way to kill and conquer. He's taller than anyone in the room by a head, scarred like a cutting board, and wearing Byzantine silk over Norse mail in a combination that shouldn't work, but somehow makes him more terrifying. The Emperor keeps glancing at his guards, calculating whether they could stop Harold if negotiations go badly. They couldn't. Everyone knows they couldn't. Harold's Mediterranean tour reads like a psychopath's gap year. After leaving Norway due to some light treason, he spent 15 years turning the Eastern world into his personal violence playground, Sicily, where he allegedly invented new siege techniques that involved catapulting diseased cattle into cities. Jerusalem, where he bathed in the Jordan River to wash off the blood of approximately everyone he met on the way. Bulgaria, where he earned the charming nickname Burner of Bulgarians for reasons that don't require much imagination. He didn't just raid these places, he studied them, learned their languages, absorbed their military secrets, and then usually set them on fire anyway, because old habits die hard. The mainstream history says Harold amassed a fortune that made him one of the richest men in Europe. The quirky detail? He supposedly hid caches of gold along his return route, creating the medieval equivalent of a treasure trail. Modern metal detectorists still find Byzantine coins in places Harold travelled through, though historians still argue whether these are his hidden wealth or just evidence of the robust stabbing people and taking their money economy he practiced. What's undeniable is that he returned to Scandinavia with enough gold to simply purchase the Norwegian throne, though he threw in some recreational regicide to keep things traditional. You watch him shift from diplomatic Greek to threats that need no translation, and the emperor's advisors are sweating through their silk robes. Harold wants safe passage for his men and ships, plus a small fortune in gifts. The alternative, implied but unspoken, involves Constantinople learning why he earned all those nicknames. He casually mentions his time in the Varangian Guard, how he knows exactly which palace walls are decorative versus structural, where the treasure vaults are located, which officials have mistresses they'd rather keep secret. He's not just threatening violence, he's threatening informed violence, the worst kind. The genius of Harold wasn't just his brutality, but his synthesis of Viking and Byzantine methods. He'd arrive at a city with Viking longships but use Greek fire. He'd negotiate imperfect Latin before reverting to berserker rage. His armies used Norse ferocity with Roman discipline, creating a military hybrid that nobody knew how to counter. One account describes him feigning retreat in perfect Byzantine tactical formation, drawing enemies into pursuit, then having hidden longships emerge from a river to cut them off. Viking ambush tactics executed with Mediterranean precision. His time as a Varangian gave him another advantage: intelligence networks. Former guard brothers served in courts from Kiev to Cairo, and Harold maintained those connections. He knew which cities had weak walls, which governors could be bribed, which trade routes were most profitable. When he finally invaded England in 1066, he brought this accumulated knowledge, maps, siege techniques, logistical planning that turned Viking raids into professional military campaigns. He almost conquered England, and if not for an arrow in the throat at Stamford Bridge, history might remember him as the Viking who reunited the North Sea Empire. The negotiation concludes with the Emperor agreeing to everything, because the alternative is finding out what happens when you refuse the world's most educated barbarian. Harold's men begin loading ships with Byzantine gold, and you notice something chilling. Many of these Vikings are wearing Eastern armor, carrying curved swords, speaking multiple languages. Harold hasn't just traveled the Mediterranean. He's transformed Viking warfare by importing the best of every culture he's encountered. They're still Vikings at heart, but now they're Vikings who understand Greek fire, Arabic mathematics, and Byzantine court poisoning techniques. As his fleet prepares to leave Constantinople, Harold composes a love poem for Elisiv of Kiev, because apparently conquering the Mediterranean wasn't keeping him busy enough. The poem is sophisticated, incorporating Byzantine literary techniques and Norse kennings in ways that shouldn't work but do. This is the ultimate Viking warrior evolution, from simple raider to cosmopolitan conqueror who can destroy your city. Explain the philosophical implications in 3 languages, then write a sonnet about it. Watching him sail away, Byzantine gold in his holds, and future conquest in his eyes. You understand why even other Vikings called him Hardrada, the hard ruler, the ruthless one, the Viking who learned too much and lived too long. You're hiding behind overturned market stalls in a Danish trading post, watching Vikings conduct psychological warfare with the precision of surgeons and the creativity of particularly disturbed artists. They haven't attacked yet, that's the point. For 3 days, they've been circling the settlement, leaving messages. This morning, you found every scarecrow in the fields redressed in the clothes of captured scouts, positioned to look like they're having tea together. Yesterday, someone discovered all the church bells had been stuffed with human hair. Nobody's sleeping because the Vikings keep playing drums that sound almost, but not quite, like heartbeats. The rhythm is slightly off, just enough to prevent your mind from tuning it out. The mastermind behind this specific nightmare is a Jarl who supposedly studied under Byzantine torturers, because apparently regular Viking psychological warfare wasn't sophisticated enough. He's taken the standard raid and terrify playbook and added layers of calculated mind-breaking that would make modern psyop specialists take notes. His men don't just leave bodies, they arrange them in tableaus that tell stories. One captured tax collector was found seated at his own desk, quill in hand, having somehow been taxidermied while still alive just long enough to sign his own confession of crimes against the common people. The message was clear. We know who you are, what you've done, and we have opinions about it. Here's your mainstream history lesson. Vikings understood that winning without fighting was the highest form of victory. The quirky detail? They had specific runes for psychological warfare, symbols that, when carved and displayed properly, were believed to induce madness in enemies. Historians still argue whether these worked through superstition or because seeing Vikings take time to perform detailed rune work on your fortifications meant they were confident enough to do arts and crafts during a siege, which is genuinely unsettling. The settlement's defenders are cracking. You can see it in their eyes, the way they jump at shadows, how they've started fighting among themselves. This morning, 2 guards got into a knife fight over whether a cloud formation looked like a dragon ship. The Vikings haven't fired a single arrow, but they've already won. This is their evolution from simple raiders to psychological warfare specialists who understood that broken minds fight worse than broken bodies. They're using fear like a siege weapon. Each strange occurrence calibrated to erode sanity just a little bit more. The sonic warfare continues evolving. The heartbeat drums shift to breathing sounds, then to something that might be children singing, but the words are wrong, like a lullaby sung backward. One night, they project sounds of a feast, laughter, clinking cups, happy conversations, while the settlement starves behind its walls. Another night, it's screaming that starts human, but gradually becomes animal. Then something that isn't quite either. The Vikings have musicians whose entire job is creating sounds that bypass rational thought and go straight to the primitive brain that knows predators are near. Then come the visual displays. Vikings emerge just outside arrow range, performing elaborate puppet shows using armor stuffed with straw and mounted on poles. The puppets act out the settlement's future, graphic demonstrations of what awaits after surrender. But here's the insidious part. They also show mercy scenarios, reasonable treatment for those who open gates willingly. They're offering a choice, but making it clear that waiting too long removes the better option. Each day, the puppet shows get slightly more violent. A countdown clock made of amateur theatre and implied dismemberment. The animals arrive next, ravens, hundreds of them, trained to circle the settlement in specific patterns. How do you train ravens? The Vikings won't say, but the birds move with unnatural coordination, forming shapes in the sky, axes, skulls, binding runes. Defenders try shooting them, but more always come. Then the Vikings release pigs wearing human clothes into the fields, and nobody wants to think too hard about why the pigs are so comfortable wearing armor. The psychological pressure builds until reality itself seems negotiable. When the settlement finally surrenders, and they always surrender, the Vikings often don't even bother raiding. They've made their point. Word spreads about what happens when you resist, and the next 3 towns pay tribute without even seeing a longship. This is weaponized reputation, warfare where the battle is won in minds before swords ever cross. The Jarl collects his psychological warfare specialists, musicians, puppet masters, animal trainers, strategic decorators, and moves on to the next target. You realize these aren't just warriors anymore. They're auteurs of fear. Each raid a performance piece in mankind's oldest theatre. The props are bones and blood, but the real performance happens in the audience's imagination, where the worst horrors always live. You're watching from a London tower as Eric Bloodaxe holds court in York, and the name suddenly makes horrible sense. His axe, displayed prominently behind his throne, isn't metaphorically bloody. It's literally crusted with what looks like generations of accumulated gore that he refuses to clean off, like a cast iron pan seasoned with murder. This is the man so violent that other Vikings, people who considered recreational dismemberment a valid hobby, asked him to leave Norway because he was bringing down the neighborhood. Now he's king of Northumbria. And you're beginning to understand why even hardened Anglo-Saxon warriors are converting to Christianity at record rates, hoping Jesus offers better protection than their previous gods. Eric's origin story reads like someone took every Viking excess and concentrated it into one person. Son of Harold Fairhair, he earned his nickname by age 12 when he murdered his way through several brothers who stood between him and power. Not in subtle, political ways. Eric doesn't do subtle. He'd show up at their halls, challenge them to single combat, then use his favorite axe to paint abstract art on the walls. His own father reportedly said Eric had too much Viking in him, which from Harold Fairhair is like a shark complaining something has too many teeth. The mainstream history tells us Eric ruled Norway briefly before being expelled by his own people. The quirky detail: he was supposedly driven out not just for excessive violence, but for practicing sorcery learned from his wife, Gunhild, who was allegedly trained by Finnish shamans. Historians still argue whether the magic was real or if Eric was just so terrifyingly unpredictable that people assumed supernatural involvement. When your normal behavior includes things like hammering captured enemies' heads onto your ship's prow as decorations, the line between natural and supernatural horror gets pretty blurry. You observe Eric's court. and it's like watching a David Lynch fever dream directed by Hieronymus Bosch. His Jarls sit at perfect attention, nobody making eye contact, because Eric has a habit of interpreting casual glances as challenges requiring immediate resolution via acts. One councillor nervously suggests increasing taxes to fund defences. Eric listens quietly, then stands, walks over, and pats the man's shoulder companionably. Everyone relaxes. Then Eric mentions that the last person who suggested taking money from his warriors is currently fertilizing a field outside the city, assuming the pieces were ever found. The councillor withdraws his suggestion and possibly loses control of his bladder. The violence isn't random. That's what makes it worse. Eric has turned brutality into statecraft. He maintains power through carefully calibrated atrocities that send specific messages. Rival claims your throne. Your entire family tree gets pruned back to the roots. Question his decisions. You become an object lesson in skeletal anatomy. But pay proper tribute, show absolute loyalty, and Eric protects you with the same excessive force. One story tells of Eric personally hunting down and creatively dismantling a band of raiders who'd attacked villages under his protection. He sent their leader's head back to their homeland with a runic message that translated roughly to, "This is what happens when you touch my things." His wife Gunhild adds another layer of terror to the regime, called Mother of Kings in the sagas. She's supposedly a sorceress who can shapeshift, control weather, and curse enemies with madness. Whether true or not, her reputation means Eric's enemies face both his physical violence and her supernatural terrorism. Together, they're like a medieval power couple from hell, complementing each other's strengths, his axe, her hexes, their combined commitment to making everyone else's life shorter and more terrifying. The kingdom Eric's building in York represents Viking violence refined to its purest form. No pretense of civilization, no Byzantine sophistication, just raw northern brutality elevated to governing principle. His laws are simple: obey or die, with sub-clauses covering various creative ways the dying might occur. His tax policy involves showing up at your door with armed men and taking what he wants. His foreign policy consists of raiding everyone within sailing distance until they pay him to stop. It's government by monster. And somehow it's working because everyone's too terrified to try alternatives. Watching Eric hold court is like observing a barely controlled natural disaster. He shifts from jovial to murderous without transition, laughing at a joke one moment and ordering executions the next. His mood swings have mood swings. Even his own warriors maintain careful distance, like handlers working with an animal that might decide their food. As the session ends and Eric stomps off to probably murder something for stress relief, you understand why his reign was brief but memorable. This is Viking violence without philosophy, purpose, or restraint. Just an axe-wielding force of nature that happens to wear a crown. The fact that civilization eventually expelled him doesn't diminish the terror. It confirms that even in the Dark Ages, there were limits to how much darkness people could tolerate. You're standing in a Norse smithy, but this isn't your typical weapons forge. It's a workshop of nightmares where Vikings are innovating new ways to make warfare more personally horrifying. The Master Smith, a one-eyed monster of a man who claims Wayland himself taught him techniques in exchange for services rendered, is explaining his latest creation. It's a spear, but the head has been designed with backwards-facing barbs that expand inside the wound. He demonstrates on a pig carcass, and even the hardened warriors watching wince at the wet sound it makes coming back out. Pain is a teacher, he says. wiping pig blood on his leather apron. And I'm an educator. The innovation extends beyond simple weapons. You're shown the Blood Eagle kit, a specialized set of tools including rib spreaders that would make modern surgeons jealous, serrated knives designed to cut through cartilage without damaging organs, and salt mixed with other compounds that prevent shock-induced unconsciousness. Someone put genuine research and development into making torture more efficient. There's even a manual, illustrated with helpful diagrams showing optimal cut angles and pressure points. The fact that Vikings developed technical documentation for atrocity tells you everything about their commitment to the craft. Here's your mainstream historical fact. Vikings were among the first to use pattern-welded steel, Damascus steel, in Northern Europe, creating blades of legendary sharpness and flexibility. The quirky detail: some smiths allegedly quenched their blades in the blood of enemies, believing it transferred the victim's strength to the weapon. Historians still argue whether this was superstition or if blood salt content actually affected the steel's properties. Either way, imagine being killed by a sword that was literally made stronger by murdering your friends first. The psychological weapons are even worse. The smith shows you screamers, arrowheads with hollow channels that create an ungodly whistling as they fly. An archer demonstrates, and the sound is like a combination of a tea kettle and a dying rabbit. Now imagine hundreds of these coming at you in the dark. They've developed war horns that produce frequencies specifically chosen to induce panic. Drums with human skin heads that create uniquely disturbing tones. And my personal favorite, the doubt blade, a sword with a slightly curved edge that makes wounds that won't close properly, ensuring slow death and maximum battlefield screaming to demoralize enemies. But the true horror is the specialized tools. Thumb screws that Vikings apparently invented centuries before they became popular in medieval torture chambers. Eye gougers with measurements marked on the handles so you could blind someone to precise depths. Devices for hamstringing that cut tendons while leaving arteries intact, creating enemies who couldn't run but took forever to die. Each tool serves dual purposes: immediate tactical advantage and long-term psychological warfare. Survivors spread stories, and stories spread fear, and fear wins battles before they start. The armor innovations focus on intimidation over protection. Helmets with faceplates depicting demons, berserkers, or worse, nothing. Just smooth metal with eye holes, turning warriors into faceless death machines. Some warriors wear armor made from human bones, particularly finger bones woven into chainmail that click and rattle with movement. The smith explains how they heat-treat the bones to prevent brittleness, while maintaining that distinctly human shape that triggers primal recognition. One warrior models a breastplate decorated with preserved human faces, tanned like leather and stretched across the metal. It's less effective than regular armor, but infinitely more effective at making enemies reconsider their life choices. The workshop's pride and joy is something called a Fear Forge, essentially a mobile psychological warfare unit. It's a cart containing tools, materials, and instructions for creating horrific displays using available battlefield resources. Need to demoralize a besieged city? The Fear Forge has templates for arranging bodies in runic patterns visible from walls. Want to terrorize pursuing enemies? It includes quick assembly frames for mounting heads at psychologically optimal heights. There's even a section on acoustic placement, how to position dying enemies so their screams echo most effectively. You realize these aren't just weapons. They're an entire philosophy of warfare that treats human fear as a resource to be harvested and refined. The Vikings have industrialized terror, creating tools and techniques that transform simple violence into calculated psychological destruction. as the smith returns to his work, crafting what appears to be a knife designed to fillet someone while keeping them conscious. You understand why Viking weapons became legendary, not because they were sharper or stronger, but because they were designed by people who understood that the most effective wound is the one that keeps hurting long after the battle ends, in the minds of everyone who sees or hears about it. The real innovation wasn't in metallurgy, it was in weaponizing trauma itself. You're hunched over a table in a Norwegian war council, watching as the greatest Viking strategists plan what will become the siege of Paris. And it's like witnessing chess masters who use human pieces and play for blood. The lead strategist, Bjorn Ironside, isn't drawing battle plans. He's creating a psychological symphony where every movement, every action, builds toward inevitable victory through mental destruction. His fingers trace river routes while he explains how they'll arrive, not as a horde, but in calculated waves, each one designed to erode defenders' hope like water wearing down stone. Warriors win battles, he says, moving carved pieces across the map, but fear wins wars. The planning detail is obsessive. They've sent merchants to Paris for months, not to trade, but to count steps between gates, memorize guard rotations, identify which defenders have families inside the walls. One spy spent 6 months as a baker's assistant just to learn which guards prefer morning bread, because men with comfortable routines die confused. Another mapped every church bell in the city, calculating how long it takes for alarm signals to travel from walls to barracks. This isn't random violence. It's warfare reduced to mathematical precision, where every variable serves the goal of maximum psychological impact. Here's your mainstream history. Viking raids weren't spontaneous violence, but carefully orchestrated campaigns planned months or years in advance. The quirky detail: they supposedly used primitive actuarial tables, calculating expected losses against projected gains with disturbing accuracy. Historians still argue whether these were formal documents or oral traditions. But the consistency of Viking risk-reward ratios suggests someone, somewhere, was keeping track of return on investment in human misery. The innovation comes in their approach to siege warfare. While contemporary armies relied on brute force, bigger catapults, longer sieges, Vikings developed what you'd recognize as systems disruption theory. Why destroy walls when you can destroy the will to defend them? Bjorn explains how they'll poison water supplies, not to kill, but to cause just enough sickness to overwhelm healers. They'll burn grain stores but leave one intact, causing riots as people fight over remaining food. Every action calculated to turn defenders against each other, making Vikings seem like the least of their problems. The river strategy is particularly brilliant. Vikings didn't just use longships for transport, they turned mobility into psychological weaponry. The plan involves sending ships up and down the Seine in seemingly random patterns, appearing and disappearing, creating an impression of overwhelming numbers. In reality, it's the same 30 ships sailing in circles, but defenders seeing sails at dawn, noon, and twilight assume hundreds of vessels. They'll beach some ships visibly while others hide in tributaries, making defenders guess whether the visible forces are the threat or the distraction. It's military theatre where the audience's imagination does most of the work. Weather planning shows another level of sophistication. They've studied seasonal patterns for optimal psychological conditions, arriving during harvest when defenders must choose between walls and crops, attacking during religious festivals when morale should be highest, but watchfulness lowest. One strategist suggests timing assaults to match church bells, training defenders to associate their own holy sounds with Viking attacks. Another proposes launching major assaults only on overcast days, using gloom as an ally in breaking spirits. They're not just planning battles, they're choreographing despair. The supply chain strategy reveals Vikings as logistical geniuses hiding behind berserker stereotypes. Instead of carrying provisions, they'll establish fear-based supply lines where settlements ahead of their route pay tribute to avoid destruction. This creates a self-fulfilling prophecy. Towns that pay prove Vikings are coming, increasing panic in cities further along. They've calculated exactly how much to demand, enough to sustain operations but not enough to make resistance seem like the better option. It's protection racketeering elevated to military doctrine, centuries before anyone coined the term. You watch them plan contingencies for every possible response. If Paris negotiates, they have demands designed to seem reasonable while establishing precedents for future extortion. If Paris fights, they have 17 different escalation strategies, each targeting different psychological pressure points. If Paris surrenders, they have protocols for controlled looting that leaves enough wealth for future raids. Sustainable pillaging, like fishing regulations but for human misery. Even their retreat plans serve psychological purposes, designed to look like tactical withdrawals rather than defeats, maintaining reputation for future campaigns. The meeting concludes with assignments that sound more like modern special operations than Viking raids. Teams designated for specific tasks: bridge burners, bell silencers, rumor spreaders, even a group whose job is befriending defenders' children near walls to make guards hesitate during assaults. As leaders disperse to prepare their forces, you realize you've witnessed something far more terrifying than berserker rage. This is violence industrialized, systematized, and optimized for psychological destruction. The Vikings aren't just raiders. They're behavioral scientists who happen to discover that the most efficient way to wealth and power runs straight through the human psyche's weakest points. You're standing in Uppsala's sacred grove, surrounded by bodies hanging from every tree like the world's most disturbing fruit. And the priests are explaining that this is just Tuesday. Welcome to the spiritual heart of Viking death culture, where the line between worship and warfare doesn't exist because they're the same thing. Every 9 years, they hang 9 of every living thing, humans, horses, dogs, even roosters, because apparently their gods have very specific requirements about death quotas. The victims aren't struggling because they volunteered, competed even, for the honor of decorating Odin's trees. This is a society where "I hope you die violently" is a blessing, not a curse. The death cult mentality permeates everything. Children play games where dying gloriously is the win condition. Teenagers practice death songs, personalized poems to recite while being killed, because nothing says, "I'm ready for adulthood," like having your murder soundtrack prepared. You watch a mother teaching her son sword work, and she's explicitly instructing him on maintaining form while fatally wounded. Anyone can fight while healthy, she explains, running him through drills while he holds rocks to simulate injury weight. But can you kill 3 men with your intestines hanging out? That's what separates warriors from corpses. Here's your mainstream historical fact. Vikings believed dying in battle guaranteed entry to Valhalla, where they'd fight all day and feast all night until Ragnarok. The quirky detail: they had specific terminology for different types of battle death, like wine connoisseurs but for mortality. Dying with a sword in hand was sword sleep. Dying while killing an enemy was red wedding. Dying after killing multiple enemies was Odin's harvest. Historians still argue whether these terms were poetic metaphors or actual categorizations used to rank afterlife accommodations like deadly frequent flyer miles. The religious framework turns every warrior into a suicide bomber with a sword. You're watching men prepare for raids, and they're not praying for victory. They're praying for glorious death. One warrior shows off scars from previous battles, disappointed he survived them. Another practices his death song, workshopping rhymes with friends like it's open mic night at the apocalypse. The priest explains that Odin himself traded his eye for wisdom and hanged himself for knowledge, setting a divine precedent that self-destruction equals enlightenment. When your supreme god is a self-mutilating knowledge junkie who collects corpses, it shapes cultural priorities in specific directions. The Valhalla recruitment process sounds like a cosmic pyramid scheme. Die gloriously, and you join Odin's army for the final battle. But here's the twist. They know they'll lose Ragnarok. The entire Viking warrior culture is built on training for a battle they're destined to lose. It's nihilism weaponized, creating warriors who fight harder because victory is meaningless compared to dying correctly. You ask a warrior about this paradox, and he grins. If the gods themselves will die, what chance do we have? Might as well make it memorable. This is military motivation through existential despair, and somehow it works. The practical applications are terrifying. Viking warriors would deliberately fight outnumbered to increase death odds. They'd refuse medical treatment for wounds that weren't immediately fatal, hoping to die in the next battle instead. Some would challenge obviously superior opponents just for the chance at a quality death. The sagas are full of warriors thanking the people who kill them, offering poetic compliments while bleeding out. One account describes a warrior who, after taking a fatal wound, spent his last moments critiquing his killer's technique and suggesting improvements for next time. The death cult extends beyond individual warriors to entire military strategies. Commanders would structure battles to maximize glorious deaths, not tactical victory. Shield walls would be deliberately weakened at points to create death funnels where warriors could die surrounded by enemies. Naval battles included designated death ships, crewed by volunteers who'd ram enemy vessels and fight until sinking. They turned tactical disadvantage into spiritual opportunity, making military prediction impossible because normal armies try to win, not optimize their defeat aesthetics. You're watching the Uppsala ceremony conclude as priests read the names of raiders who died this year, and the crowd cheers each one like sports heroes. Children who lost fathers beam with pride. Widows brag about their husband's death quality. The entire society has turned mortality into motivation, creating warriors who aren't just unafraid of death. They're actively pursuing it like a career goal. As bodies sway in the sacred grove and families celebrate their losses, you understand the ultimate Viking psychological weapon, an entire culture that turned humanity's deepest fear into its greatest aspiration. How do you defeat an enemy who considers your victory their reward? You're standing in a London street in 1066, watching Anglo-Saxon mothers hurry their children inside, whispering the Northmen are coming, like it's both prayer and curse. It's been 2 centuries since the great heathen army terrorized these lands, but Viking has become less a nationality and more a species of nightmare that parents invoke to ensure obedience. The irony is that actual Vikings are mostly gone, converted to Christianity, settled into farming, transformed into the medieval equivalent of regional managers. But the fear they bred has mutated into something immortal, passed down through generations like psychological DNA, ensuring that somewhere in the collective European mind, a longship is always approaching through morning mist, The legacy lives in language itself. Berserk entered every European tongue, because apparently all cultures needed a word for murderously insane. Ransack comes from Old Norse ransaka, meaning to search a house, though Vikings gave it modern connotations by typically searching with axes. Slaughter derives from Old Norse slatter, originally meaning butchered meat, which says everything about Viking attitudes toward human bodies. Even skill comes from their word meaning to discern or separate, presumably enemies from their limbs. Vikings didn't just raid Europe. They colonized its vocabulary with terms for violence so specific that we still use them because we haven't invented better ones. The mainstream history shows Viking influence in law, trade, and urban development. The quirky detail: medieval European military manuals included specific sections on Viking-proofing fortifications, featuring architectural innovations like doors too narrow for berserkers and moats designed to prevent longship approaches. Historians still argue whether these defenses worked or just made defenders feel better, like security theatre against historical trauma. Some castles included Viking bells, special alarms distinct from fire or regular attack warnings, because apparently Viking raids deserved their own acoustic signature in the Panic Symphony. You observe how deeply Viking tactics influenced military evolution. The concept of psychological warfare as a primary strategy rather than battlefield side effect. Viking innovation. Using mobility to create uncertainty. Viking specialty. Treating reputation as a weapon requiring constant maintenance. Pure Viking thinking. Medieval commanders studied Viking raids like business schools study successful startups, trying to replicate their disruptive innovation without the whole wearing enemies' faces as masks thing. The Vikings had discovered military principles so effective that Europe spent centuries adapting them while trying to forget where they learned them. The Catholic Church's response reveals the spiritual scar Vikings left. They created specific prayers against Viking raids, incorporated into regular services for centuries after the threat passed. A furore Normanorum libera nos Domini. From the fury of the Northmen deliver us. O Lord, became Christianity's most popular addition to litanies. Monks developed entire theological frameworks explaining Vikings as divine punishment for sin, because random violence was somehow more terrifying than deserved violence. The Church turned Viking raids into morality plays where salvation meant not facing berserkers, accidentally creating religious motivation through weaponized terror of pagans. The genetic legacy runs deeper than fear. DNA studies show Viking genetics spread throughout Europe, but not through settlement, through trauma. The patterns suggest rapid, violent spreading of Norse genetics, academically confirming what medieval chronicles described more colorfully. But here's the truly disturbing part. Regions with highest Viking genetic markers also show historical patterns of increased military aggression, as if violence bred true. Whether cultural or genetic, Vikings didn't just raid Europe, they rewired it, creating populations primed for warfare by generations of selective pressure, favoring those who could survive encounters with bears wearing human skin. The most lasting legacy might be in military psychology itself. Vikings proved that warfare wasn't about who had bigger armies or better weapons, but who could make opponents defeat themselves through fear. Every military since has incorporated psychological operations, but Vikings did it intuitively, turning human consciousness into a battlefield where they always had advantage. They showed that reputation could be weaponized, that uncertainty was more powerful than strength, that making enemies imagine horrors was more efficient than actually committing them, though they did plenty of both just to maintain brand consistency. Standing in this London street, watching ordinary people still flinch at Nordic accents 3 generations after the last true Viking raid, you understand their ultimate achievement. Vikings didn't just conquer territories or accumulate wealth, they conquered the concept of safety itself, ensuring that every dark night, every strange sail, every unexplained noise would carry echoes of their presence. They turned fear into inheritance, passing down trauma like heirlooms, creating a legacy measured not in gold or land, but in the permanent revision of human threat assessment. The Vikings are gone, but in the part of the mind that processes danger, they're immortal, forever approaching through fog, forever seconds from impact, forever turning civilization's nightmares into tomorrow's history lessons. And now, as our journey through Viking terror comes to its close, let your breathing slow and your mind settle. Those fierce Northmen who stalked through these tales, the berserkers and shield maidens, the blood eagles and wolf warriors, they're fading back into the mists of history where they belong. The longships are pulling away from shore, their dragon heads disappearing into gentle fog. The sound of battle drums softens, becoming nothing more than your own heartbeat, steady and calm. Those terrifying warriors are returning to their sagas and songs, leaving you safe in your warm bed, far from their ancient fury. The past is past, and you're here, now, in this peaceful moment. Tomorrow's light will chase away any lingering shadows, but tonight, you can rest knowing their stories are just that, stories to help you drift into sleep. Let the Vikings sail away into dreams, their violence transformed into distant adventure, their legacy nothing more than fascinating whispers from a time long gone. Sleep well, knowing you're safe from history's nightmares, carried only into gentle dreams of your own making. Sweet dreams.